Hello and welcome to Worlds Apart. For much of the Syrian war, the anti-Iranian Arab consensus has played handsomely into Israel's hands, and that is until the Friends of Syria group imploded from within. With Turkey and Qatar now being more open in their defiance of the Saudis and the American stance growing ever more unpredictable, where does it leave Israel? Well, to discuss it, I'm now joined by Gilead Sher, one of Israel's senior peace negotiators. Mr. Sher, it's such an honor, such a pleasure to have you on the show. Thank you very much for your time.
Hi, thank you.
Now, it's believed that Israel has largely stayed out of the Syrian war, even though occasionally it did conduct airstrikes as well as had some assistance program going on to help the anti-government groups operating in and around Golan Heights. What is your sense about this conflict? Where is it heading now?
Well, it seems that the conflict, this terrible, tragic bloodshed, is moving slowly towards some kind of a subsided arrangement. And Israel has been very consistent since the outset of this conflict. It does not intervene in this internal tragedy. We've been on the sidelines since the outset, as you know, except for one thing, and this is treating the war-wounded. Whoever needed assistance or life-saving got it from Israel.
Well, Mr. Sher, you mentioned a phrase, subsided arrangement, and if you look at the latest events in Syria, the Americans took down a Syrian jet a few days ago. The Iranians have just fired ballistic missiles at some ISIS targets in Syria. It looks like things are really heating up rather than entering a stage of what you call subsided arrangement. Do you take that as a sort of calculated bargaining, various players trying to secure a better negotiating position for themselves, or is the situation progressively getting out of control?
No, I don't think that it gets out of control, and I believe that the phrase that you used, the calculated bargaining, is what we see now. Unfortunately, what we're seeing is Assad staying. That means that Iran has the upper hand, which was, of course, not something that Israel has ever desired, and I don't believe that the other parties wanted that, and especially not the United States. But what Russia could not do and what America could not do, I believe that Israel, not being omnipotent, could not and wanted and did not want to do. So that's where things are. I believe that any solution, any final settlement of the conflict in Syria should not compensate Iran, should not award Iran any prizes, and should not award Assad. So left to be seen what kind of arrangement will be put in place.
Well, absolutely left to be seen, but I'm sure you're familiar with the Russian position, which essentially sees it as a choice either between Assad, which you may or may not like, and hardline, jihadi-oriented rebels in charge of Damascus. Can you explain to me why is that option more palatable for Israel?
I did not say it's more palatable, but the fact of the matter is that we do not have a choice between one very good option and one very bad option. We have a choice between a bad option and a worse option.
Some in Russia believe that the first personal meeting between the Russian and American presidents on the sidelines of the G20 meeting may clarify the situation, but I wonder if those hopes are really justified, because Donald Trump just visited Israel a short while ago. Do you think the Israelis have a clearer impression of where he stands on, let's say, the Syrian issue, or for that matter, on any other?
Well, if you refer to the visit that President Trump just said in Israel last month, I believe that things were not too clear after the visit. Except for one issue, which is the Israeli-Palestinian conflict, in which we do see that there is a kind of a prolonged effort with the subsequent visit of two envoys of President Trump for a kind of a process that would bring the parties once again to talk to one another around the negotiation table, or in a more regional outlook of talks. And I believe that that this is what we are witnessing now, a kind of an ongoing effort to test the water of the possibilities lying ahead for renewal of some kind of political process.
Now, Mr. Sher, you're being very, very cautious in the way you phrase whatever progress may have been achieved. But I think, and I've seen a number of Israeli and Arab publications coming out with headlines suggesting that the United States was back in the Middle East. Do you think that's really the case, to the extent of Americans being able to call the shots in the region, as opposed to just sending a couple of envoys or taking a couple of pictures in front of the Wailing Wall? What does it really mean to be back in the region as far as Israel is concerned?
Well, it requires a genuine effort to reassemble what we refer to as the quartet. That means America, Russia, the EU, and the United Nations, in order to have a more coherent international approach to resolving the Arab-Israeli conflict in general, and the Israeli-Palestinian conflict in particular. And I believe that this has started with the good relationship that President Trump and President Putin have between the two of them, and some European, I would say, readiness to engage in a more in a more serious manner. And then I would hope for a more binding, continuous process that would have at least three-pronged. First one would be regional. We have a lot of common concerns with certain relatively moderate Sunni regimes around us. And then we have also to bilaterally continue the negotiations with the Palestinians on the basis of transitional agreements and gradual interim processes that would bring us closer to the two-state reality before we get to the two-state solution. And of course, we need to complement that by the third prong, which is the independent constructive steps that would complement those steps and reverse the trend towards the one binational state, which would be a disaster for both Israel and the Palestinians.
Well, Mr. Sher, in the meantime, we have another regional conflict brewing, this time between Qatar and Saudi Arabia, with Turkey taking the Qatar side. The world is well exposed to the consequences, sometimes disastrous consequences, of the Shia-Sunni rivalry. How do you think these intra-Sunni tensions bursting into the open are going to affect the regional dynamics?
Look, I'm not referring to anything like a regional conference with a lot of photo ops, and I'm talking about a serious process that relates to countering the Iran expansionism and aspiration for possessing weaponry, nuclear weaponry. I'm referring to the radical Islamistic fundamentalism. I refer to to countering terrorism, ISIS, and other proxies of Iran. And I believe that that this should be the grounds for discussing within that framework a beginning of a process of normalization between Israel and some leaders of the Arab League and the Arab world, and within that, of course, a process that would resolve eventually the Israeli-Palestinian conflict, which is in the interest of both the Arab world, the Palestinians, and first and foremost, Israel.
Well, Mr. Sher, if there is one country benefiting from the Saudi-Qatar path, it's definitely Iran. I wonder, what do you think is the Iranian secret? It seems that the Iranians have a knack for turning the failures of their geopolitical foes into their favor. Is it the Iranians who are so smart, or their adversaries who are not smart enough?
It's basically both, because what we see is a very shrewd and clever Iran playing very good its cards, and a not too coherent international policy led by the United States vis-a-vis Iran. They are clearly very much a source of concern to most of the free world, the Western world. I believe that President Trump started quite early in his first term to deal with these problems, as unpredictable and unexpected as he is on all the issues. But at least we see that in the first quarter of his first term as President of the United States, he has put a lot of energy into the Middle East and into the Israeli-Palestinian, Israeli-Arab conflict. And I hope that, that this would signal to both to Iran and to the rest of the potential allies for countering Iran that he is serious in that respect.
You mentioned the free world, and I think it's quite clear to me that when you look at the rigidity of Israel's policy towards Iran, it compares to only one country, which is Saudi Arabia. Everybody else has moved on. Everybody else is flexible. Qatar, Turkey, Jordan, Egypt, not to mention Russia, the European Union, even the United States under the Obama administration, and we know that there are still some elements of the Democratic administration in power in the United States, so I wouldn't count on the United States completely reversing its term. I want to ask you, why do you think Israel is still stuck in this position? Because it has a reputation for pragmatism, for flexibility, for being able to compromise. Why can't it find a suitable compromise with Iran?
Well, it's very simple. It's the other way around. It's not Israel that is stuck. It's Iran that is stuck in its aspiring and call for annihilating Israel. We have no choice but to be very rigid and very firm in our opposing Iran and its proxies and its perpetrating of terrorism, not only in the Middle East and vis-a-vis Israelis and Jews, but everywhere over the globe, and we know that since ever. I believe that Iran's proxies, such as Hezbollah and Hamas, have also united against one enemy of them, which is Israel and Zionism and the Jews and the West in general.
Well, Mr. Sher, we have to take a short break now, but we will be back in just a few moments. Stay tuned. Welcome back to Worlds Apart. We are talking to Gilead Sher, one of Israel's senior peace negotiators. Mr. Sher, you recently published an interesting article describing how Trump can apply his deal-making principles to the Israeli-Palestinian peacemaking. And you start with this think big advice. You suggest that he should include the regional actors, particularly the Gulf states. But again, you make no mention of Iran, which definitely has an interest in the Palestinian question. It has a leverage there. Does excluding Iran really represent thinking big as opposed to same old from Israel?
Well, I can only humbly say that what I tried to do is to take the 11 principles that were mentioned in his 1986 book, The Art of the Deal, and apply them. One of the principles that you've just mentioned is to get a larger outlook into the Middle East, and employ the rules that he himself is promoting in his book, looking at the broader Middle Eastern ballpark. And it might so happen that in the future, Iran also will be part of that, but it depends on how compliant it will be with the JCPOA that was signed 2 years ago, and how genuine would be their implementation of all the measures and provisions within this agreement.
Mr. Sher, you are doing this typical Israeli thing of dragging a totally separate issue into the Israeli-Palestinian question. I mean, I understand that it's kind of accepted as that the only way to get in Trump's good graces is to quote his own ideas to him. But again, I want to ask you the same question again. Why is it excluding Iran going to present any new framework, especially now that the regional powers seem to be in such a disarray? You called for involving the regional actors, but they cannot agree between themselves. Do you think they would put all their grievances aside for the sake of the Palestinians?
No, of course not. I don't think that that this is intertwined, but I believe that the Israeli-Palestinian conflict has to be resolved in a two-state for two people manner, and that there should be a boundary between Israel and the state of Palestine. So I believe that this is the right course of things to be looking for, and including Iran in this process seems to be very, very kind of redundant, because Iran looks at exactly the other direction. How to not allow this resolution of the Israeli-Palestinian conflict to become a reality, because this nurtures the animosity, the hatred, and the hostile approach of the Iranians towards the Zionism, towards Israel, towards the Jews, etc. Plus, you know, I'm not here to provide any advices to President Trump or to America. I'm just thinking, researching, and looking for the best options for my country, for my people, and for the other human beings around us.
Well, speaking about your country, I mean, you just blamed Iran for essentially sabotaging the peace process, but let's look at how well Israeli negotiators performed, because, you know, I find it interesting that in most of the business schools around the world, you see Israeli negotiators, former Israeli negotiators teaching in the MBA program the art of deal making. Do you think the deal that Israel has so far secured for itself over the last several years, decades rather, of on and off negotiations is a good deal? Does it speak to the mastery of Israeli negotiators?
Well, you know, first, it's not the problem of negotiators. It's the problem of, you know, allowing the interests to of the two sides, the opposing and converging interests, to be converged together by the leadership. The success of any kind of deal lies in the courage and the vision and the political will of the leaders in question. That's number one. Number two, I've seen conflicts, intractable, protracted conflicts all around the world and throughout history for dozens and hundreds of years, finally being resolved. So ours is not that different. We've been negotiating for now for 25 years or so, since the early 90s. Okay, but throughout those 2.5 decades, we've only been negotiating permanent status or a comprehensive peace in a period of maybe 2.5, 3 years. So we might need more.
I'm not sure the Palestinians have another 100 of years to wait out until we all negotiate those issues. I've interviewed a number of high-ranking Palestinian negotiators myself, and they all independently say on record that the way Israeli side behaves itself is very off-putting. For example, Foreign Minister of the Palestine, Riyad al-Maliki, told me that behind closed doors, he saw Israeli negotiators dancing on the tables. He saw them singing.
I'm sorry to interrupt you. I've never ever seen such a scene during negotiations. Never. And I've negotiated with the Palestinians under official and non-official heads for hundreds and thousands of hours. Never, ever have I seen that. What I have seen is the Palestinians negotiating an all or nothing kind of deal, rather than negotiating, compromising, and agreeing on certain concessions that will bring eventually peace. We have tried to do that, and we are still ready to make historic concessions in order to make peace, in order to end the conflict, in order to put finality to all claims.
But
I haven't seen that approach from the Palestinian side until now. Every time that we reached a juncture in which there was a possibility to resolve the conflict, even not entirely, but most of its parts, the Palestinians just walked away. And I don't know what will happen next.
Well, I think it's clear what will happen next. The Palestinians are now trying to internationalize the conflict simply because they don't want to deal with the Israelis anymore. They're willing to deal with anyone but Israel. I wonder, what do you think Israel can realistically do to instill, to sort of rekindle their faith in the pragmatism of those negotiations? Do you think anything could be done so that the Palestinians see a value in continuing those talks with you?
Look, let me be very frank with you. I believe that the gaps are getting wider and wider, but I believe that what we need is to be in one room continuously in a binding manner and talk to one another. And I believe that we need to complement that with a regional process that would sustain the bilateral process, and to complement that with acts and steps and measures that would be taken independently by the respective parties, and allow a two-state reality to start to evolve instead of the one binational state reality that we are both deteriorating into. I believe that what we need for that is a facilitator that would put together a binding process that is a continuous one, and understand that this will not be done as a one-time deal. This is a gradual process that will have layer over layer until everything is stable enough and solid enough to walk over and look for a coexistence between Israelis and Palestinians, each one in its own land.
Well, Mr. Sher, while you're talking about coexistence, the Israeli Prime Minister famously said, and he still sticks to that point of view, that there would be no Palestinian state under his watch. And as cynical as that may sound, I think that statement actually is true, because nobody envisions that that's going to happen within the next decade or so. What do you think needs to change in Israel for the Israeli elites, for people like yourself, for the political leaders, to understand that they don't have that much time for the incremental approach that you seem to be advocating, that sooner or later the deadline will come and then it will be late?
Well, I'll tell you one thing that is obvious. You cannot do at the same time perpetration of terrorism and incitement and hostilities vis-a-vis Israelis and Jews, internationalizing, delegitimizing Israel, demonizing Israelis, etc., and say, well, let's make peace now. And you cannot do anything that is similar to negotiating when you are under these kind of circumstances. So I think that for the Palestinians, I would not hope for one more resolution on the table that is in favor of the Palestinian state, because this will not form or establish a Palestinian state. I believe that only throughout discussions, talks, and negotiations we could advance towards a mutual future of understanding, of compromising. And for Israel's, I believe that it is our duty. It is my own leadership duty and our own civil society and constituency duty to look for every way to preserve the Jewish democratic character and identity of Israel. This is what the founding fathers of Israel 70 years ago had in mind. This is what I believe would be the best for Israel in order to encompass its core values, its humanitarian values, its Jewish values within recognized and secure boundaries. We are open to negotiating that, but we cannot accept the all or nothing plus terrorism that comes along with this formula. When I negotiated in Camp David and Taba and afterwards, and also during the other rounds of negotiations on permanent status, what we had as a leading formula was nothing is agreed until everything is agreed. And I think that it's time that we change that into whatever is agreed or mutually coordinated should be implemented.
Now, Mr. Sher, unfortunately, we have to leave it there. I really appreciate your being here and sharing your insights with us. You've been very gracious with your time. And I invite all our viewers, Palestinian, Israelis, Americans, Russians, to leave their comments on our Twitter, Facebook, YouTube pages. And I hope to see you again. Same place, same time, here on Worlds Apart.